Do you want to learn the tricks that top leaders use to get the most out of themselves and their teams? Well, Naftali Hoff is here to help. Lead to succeed. Picks the brains of top leaders to learn about their challenges, insights, and best practices. Here's Naftali.
Hello, Lead to Succeed Nation. It's Naftali Hoff, and welcome to Lead to Succeed, episode 169. Today, I have the pleasure of speaking with Manar Morales. Manar is a national expert in building human-centered workplace cultures that prioritize diversity, flexibility, and well-being. As the founder and CEO of the Diversity and Flexibility Alliance, she has over 18 years of experience helping organizations create inclusive environments and implement effective, flexible work strategies. A sought-after speaker and author, her forthcoming book, The Flexibility Paradigm, provides a roadmap for creating adaptive, resilient workplaces. Recognized with the President's Lifetime Achievement Award, Manar is committed to empowering individuals and organizations to thrive in today's evolving work landscape. Manar, so glad to have you on the show today.
Happy to be here. Thank you. I'm excited for our conversation.
My pleasure. Likewise. Okay, so let's get right into it. Tell us about you. Who are you? How did you get here? Let's fill in the gaps from the bio.
So I started as an employment litigator, career-wise, and then had my first son 23 years ago. I have 3 boys, so I was defining myself by that as well. And it really shaped in terms of the kind of flexibility I was looking for at the time. And so for me, starting this journey as it related to flexibility really came out of my own desire for flexibility and the need for it. So from the employment litigator, kind of fast forward in 2012, I founded the Alliance. So that's kind of the work that we have been doing, like you said, looking at how do we create human-centered workplaces at the intersection of workplace flexibility, diversity, equity, inclusion, and well-being.
Okay, so a lot to unpack, but let me go to one specific detail, if you don't mind, before we do that. Yeah. What was it that you saw or didn't see that propelled you from being, I like flexibility and it's important for my needs, to starting an actual organization, shifting careers in effect, to create that, to fill that void in the marketplace?
What I saw was that having the experience of other people come up to me and say, look, if I could have done it the way that you did it, I wouldn't have left necessarily. And it started me to think about what is it that organizations can be doing and why can't we have more? There was nothing special about what I did. So why couldn't we have more organizations that were experiencing flexibility in a way that was a win-win? I saw the benefits I had for it personally, but I also saw the benefit the organizations I was working for got from the kind of flexibility that they enabled me to have. And so that shift really got me thinking more about how do we create more flexible work environments, which is a win-win for everyone.
Right. And I'm just curious about on some deals. I happen to have currently a very flexible work environment because I work for myself, so I get to decide when and where to show up, so to speak. But for a long time, as a head of school and before that as an educator, I was very much tethered to the school day. And obviously the expectation, I shouldn't say obviously, but the expectation was, and I think still is for the most part, to be physically present in the same space as the students or, the school at large. So in some environments, it's a little bit easier to work with in that sense, based on how your schedule aligns with others, etc. But my wife, when we relocated, we had been living in Chicago. We had moved to Atlanta, where I took that head of school position. From that point on, she has been working remotely. Yeah. And it's been very transformative for her. It's created a lot of opportunity family-wise and just managing things at home while simultaneously being able to be present at work, and to work with maybe greater focus because of the fact that she's able to attend to a lot of the other responsibilities that otherwise would be weighing on her. And I remember when we first were married and our kids were little and I was teaching, she was going downtown to the previously named Sears Tower, and that was where her office was. And between the commute and being at work, etc., a lot of things fell on me, and I wasn't really super flexible because I had classes to teach. So I'm curious to know, what kind of environments are people in? Is it mostly women? Is it men as well? To what degree? Break it down for us a little bit more about who, you feel are really looking for this kind of flexibility, And is this a new thing? I know it's new in terms of maybe trending up that we're offering it, but is it because our needs have changed? Or is it simply because there's more awareness of what's possible with technology and things of that nature?
Sure. And there's a lot in that question. So I want to first start off because I think it's important to think about what one of the things I talk about in the flexibility paradigm is this idea of holistic flexibility. In other words, it's not one size fits all. And so how do you create flexible work environments that meets the needs across the board? So for example, if you're in an industry in which presence of like you can't do that virtually, there are other forms of flexibility, though, a school, for example, could offer, whether it's reduced hours. So there are certainly part-time opportunities they might provide. That's a form of flexibility. Job sharing is a form of flexibility. Shifting hours is a form of flexibility, too, in terms of even looking at the school day when somebody is teaching. Maybe it's saying, like, you can come in a little bit later, you're staying a little later. So I think it's really important when we talk about flexibility, we don't just think about one model, but we think about let's take the position and look at what form of flexibility can work for that position. Now, the who part of it is one of the things I talk about in the book is in order for flexibility to work, you have to degender, deparent, and destigmatize. In other words, it can't just be seen as for women. It can't just be seen as something that is just for parents, but it's everybody needs differing flexibility in their lives. And let's not just say it's for this particular individual, but how do we really look at everybody needs it? Let's create the kinds of flexibility that everybody needs. And then you talked about, is it new? I think flexibility has existed. One of the things I go into a whole history of flexibility in the book because I think people think, COVID kind of made everybody be thinking about it because we were forced to do it. And so certainly I say that the way that 9/11 forever changed how we work, forever how we changed how we travel, COVID will forever change how we work. But we were having flexible work environments prior to COVID too, right? It's just suddenly everybody had a grand experiment with one form of flexibility. And so not a new concept. Certainly I have been looking at this. 2012, I founded the Alliance, but prior to that, at least since 2006, really looking at flexibility, it's existed for a long time. And so it's important to think about how it's changed, what we've learned, and how we've evolved, both with technology as well, how that has impacted our ability to work in the ways that we can work more flexibly.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So what would you say to a traditional employer, maybe someone a bit skeptical, perhaps a little bit older, so has seen, let's say, a more traditional work environment for much of their career, now being confronted with these various requests for flexibility and thinking to themselves, this is not how I did it, or not how my parents did it, and how much is too much? Like that question as well.
I think that idea around, this is not how I did it. We used to get that a lot kind of prior, to COVID. There would be a lot of one of the things that leaders would say to me is, I never had any flexibility when I was starting my career.
Right.
And suddenly everybody wants it. And I say, yeah, you might not have had flexibility, but you had some boundaries that people don't have today. In other words, if you think about the ability to be on Zoom calls, the ability to have a cell phone and people can reach you at any moment of the day, right? There were boundaries that were enabled long ago that people could have. They could go on vacation at times where nobody could reach them, or they could go to a school performance. They could go to dinner, right? And there wasn't an ability to reach you. And so there were different levels of boundaries. But the other thing I will say is that we have 5 generations in the workplace today. Right? So if you look at the fact that we have 5 generations in the workplace, people with differing needs, that you have to, as you're designing your workplaces and as you are leading your teams, think about that you have to lead for the workforce that you have, not what you used to have. And so how do we evolve too? I think one of the important things as leaders is this concept of we have to evolve. Like we have to change. We have to think about what was possible 10 years ago is now possible. What is not wasn't possible 10 years ago is now possible today. And a good leader is one who's saying, how am I continuing to evolve with the times and look forward as opposed to looking backwards all the time?
Right. Okay, but I still want you to make an argument for me, if you don't mind, about the real benefits that I stand to get as the employer. So yeah, I could be more flexible and maybe think about it differently. And you're right, you make a good point that my people are on call now, maybe more than they ever have been. But I still want to know practically what are the benefits that I stand to get, whether it's productivity,
Yeah.
engagement, other metrics that you could point to. I'm sure you have some data here
Yeah.
that you could point to that would help me to feel better about this uncomfortable shift that you're asking me to make.
Yeah, so actually, it's one of the things in the framework we start with. The first step is to reflect on the purpose. What does flexibility make possible for you as an organization? And that's really starting to look at what's our talent pool? What do they want? What are their needs? What's driving them? So, from a talent perspective, how can we use flexibility as an advantage for us for recruitment, retention, advancement? Who are we keeping? How do we have it? If you look at the data around generational needs and wants, the younger generations are placing a really great high need on flexibility, on wanting that. You look at diversity, right? Who wants and needs? Yes, you absolutely should offer it for everybody. But does it have a greater impact on your ability to retain and recruit women, for example, or caregivers in the workplace? Like, what are the advantages that we can get from a talent perspective? And then productivity is a piece of, if people are given the kind of flexibility they need to thrive, that's a benefit for us from productivity, right? There are some people who are very productive in an office environment and they thrive in that environment. And there are other people who say, if I'm working from home, I get so much more done than when I'm working in the office. And I'm shifting what I do when I work in the office versus when I'm working virtually, for example. So we can see that increase in productivity, or someone who's saying, I'm saving on commute time, and that impacts my productivity. Certainly from engagement, right? From a psychological safety perspective, if you look at the work of Dr. Amy Edmondson on psychological safety being one of those key things that get teams to be more functioning, where do I feel like I can speak up about what's going on at work? Where can I feel like I can speak up about what's going on at home? Where do I feel greater psychological safety, which then leads to greater engagement? So all of those things I think are really important for you to lay out, not just what the business case is out there, flexibility, but specifically what is it doing for your organization?
Hmm. So let's drill down for just a minute before I shift back to your book and some other things about psychological safety. So you talked about in the context of flexibility. What other things could leaders do to create more of that feeling of safety, psychologically and otherwise, within the workplace?
I think what was interesting about what happened during COVID is I would say that COVID didn't just change how we work, but it changed people's expectations from work.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that we got a window into COVID suddenly is you couldn't ignore what was happening in people's lives, right?
Mm-hmm.
Suddenly, everybody was having to talk about what their experiences were, what were they dealing with, how could their like I had team leaders who would say to me, I would never start a team meeting with on a scale of 1 to 10, how are you feeling? But I did those check-ins during COVID, right? Because
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
all of the pressures that people were feeling, we suddenly saw people as humans and not
Mm-hmm.
just as employees, right? And so I think that idea of leaning into what is happening in your life, like how do I make things possible for you, both possible at work and possible to help with what you have going on in your day to day, it opens flexibility, I think allows for conversations for people to have about what's going on in their life. Like we can't, I think sometimes we have employers who expect us to sort of shed everything that's going on in our life as we walk into the door and we're just focused
Mm-hmm.
on, and we all know that's not how we operate as humans.
Right.
So
Right.
that opening that door for broader conversations. I also think what it did was I had leaders who would say to me, I would have never worked a flexible work schedule. And suddenly I had one leader say to me, my wife is running a COVID clinic. Like I can't, like I have to be the one suddenly on top. And we have 4 kids, and I'm the one who is managing this team. It was somebody, in a law practice, managing this team and having to do all of the things. Like I never experienced that before. And suddenly I'm seeing all of the things that I didn't even realize were
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
happening because of my own flexibility that I need and how I can respond. So there were experiences too from leaders having experiences with flexibility that they never had before.
Yeah. So that sounds like a real paradigm shift. And your upcoming book, The Flexibility Paradigm, outlines a roadmap for resilient workplaces. So what would you say are some of the key takeaways that you hope your readers will get out of your book?
Yeah, one of the things is to understand first that flexibility isn't just a policy change, that it is a whole culture shift. So really, when you think about the kind of needs that you have around flexibility, is how do I look at flexibility and say, we aren't just doing this from a policy perspective, but we're actually shifting the ways in which we work to our advantage. Like, what does flexibility make possible for you as an organization is an important piece for people to look at. So really understanding that also there, in order for flexibility to work, you have to be intentional, you have to be inclusive, and you have to be iterative. So the book really is meant to give that sort of roadmap to say, how do we really design flexibility so that it works for everyone, including the needs of the organization? This isn't just about we're doing this out
Yeah,
of our hearts for the employees, but we get a
that's an
benefit.
important, right. That's an important consideration. I was actually going to ask you next about that because you did talk about policy change, and policy is, as a former educator, so I was actually just listening back to a talk I did recently on differentiation. So the idea, the concept, which, is a discussion in and of itself, how to what degree teachers can be expected to do this, but the concept is that you've got X number of students in your classroom. And so, do we do a one size fits all, which might have been the traditional approach, teacher at the front of the room, here's everything on the board, you're all expected to know it, and you're all expected to do it at the same level and in the same way. And differentiation says that we need to sort of layer that back and say, how can we meet the needs of different students, meet them where they are, all these kinds of things.
Yeah.
At the same time, a school does have to have some degree of policy. So, for example, if I want to differentiate how I treat Amy, and maybe she has certain learning needs that require certain modifications, what does that mean practically in terms of her grade? What does it mean in terms of advancing her within our academic program to the next level, et cetera? Those are real, important questions that have to be considered because at the end of the day, the system has a certain level of rigidity to it. You're moving along. You can't be super, super flexible and say, oh, second grade was a bit of a bump for so and so. And so we're going to do a little bit of repeat and then move them into third grade material because the class as a whole has moved into third grade, if you're following what I'm saying. So
Yep.
bringing it back to the work environment, we talk about policy. On the one hand, you need a policy that can stand up to all different types of applications, right? So as we talked about, your flexibility, your needs look different than somebody else's. How do you create a policy? Maybe this is a long way of asking a relatively straightforward question, but hopefully gave it context to get to where my mind was thinking. How do you create a policy that could be sufficiently flexible, that allows you to meet the needs of individual employees and simultaneously is universally applicable and relevant, where people don't come and say, why did you give so and so X and me Y? That's not fair, or I feel like I'm being mistreated, or I'm feeling like you're not factoring in my needs the way you factored in her needs.
Yeah. So I think in terms of on the policy perspective, you have a policy that you're putting out that says we offer this forms of flexibility, and some of it one of the things I suggest in the book is that you do an audit of positions so that you can understand what are the kinds of flexibility that you offer. Then I would say have a central place where people are going to go to talk about that, generally HR and not the individual team leader or manager that somebody has, because HR or talent is hopefully holding to say, we are evaluating everybody that comes in, and it's not to the whim of the individual manager. So that's the kind of the real practical ways of saying, here's a policy, here's what we allow. I'll give you another example of, because people talk about it with respect to hybrid work environments. You might say that we expect you to be in the office 3 days a week, let's say. And an organization can roll out that policy. Now, individual teams within the organization can customize that and say, yeah, 3 days a week for us as a team, we want people in the office, let's say Tuesday and Thursday, and then you get to choose a day. Or we want this because we actually very much are all working together on certain things. So we at least need one anchor day. So you still get 3 days a week, but like we need one anchor day in this team. Or some other team might say it doesn't actually really matter. 3 days a week, everybody gets to choose what the days are. So there's levels of customization that even if a general policy is set, you can allow individual teams to create to make them function better or in alignment with how they work together.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So earlier, as you were talking and talking about just various changes in the workplace and whatnot, I was thinking of dropping in an AI related question, but I wasn't sure, how much you're dealing with it. So I didn't want to put you in a position potentially where it wouldn't be alignment with what you interact with on a day-to-day basis. But regardless, you are definitely thinking out into the future as you're looking at the present. What would it, if you could predict something meaningful, like a meaningful change, a meaningful shift in the workplace as we go out 10, 20 years into the future. Obviously, AI is going to be playing a significant role, though we don't know exactly what that's going to look like. Is there anything in particular that you're noticing that you would say the future workplace will be this,
Yeah.
in contrast even to the current workplace, which is certainly a big shift from the previous workplace, as we've already discussed?
I mean, I think the role of technology, enabling our ability to be connected, to be to the extent that there might be technology where somebody can appear to be in the room when they're not in the room, or appear to be on a stage when they're not really there, but they're being um, put on that stage in some, I don't know a lot about the the technical terms, but the ability to have people be in places and it appear as if it is them like in a front of a room. I think the kinds of advances of technology only helps with the kind of flexibility we're talking about. Like if you think about if COVID happened 20 years ago, what would have been the experience and our ability to remain connected and remain and be ability to do the work if it had happened then than when it happened for us, right? Like because of the ability for Zoom to happen and like 10, 20 years ago, people weren't doing Zoom, right? Like that wasn't
Sure.
even, and it,
Didn't
so
exist.
yeah. And so
Yeah.
this idea that technology or cell phones, right? Like even that, right? Like if you think about technology has, yes, enabled us to be more available. That's what we were going back at earlier in the conversation of the idea of where people look back and say, well, I didn't have that kind of flexibility. Yeah. And you didn't have the kind of technology either that had you reachable at all times. So I always think people think about like my office is these four walls. And I would say for most people, their office is wherever their laptop is, right? Like it's so I think if we look out the ways in which the advances of technology that we haven't even fully tapped into that are happening will enable this, will just even move the kind of the desire and the need for flexibility and the ability to make it work seamlessly even greater.
So let's talk about maybe the flip side of all these wonderful benefits of accessibility and whatnot. What are some things that you're hearing, maybe not observing directly, maybe yes, with your own team or with others that you interact with? What are some of the pitfalls of this new flexibility, of this, all the various tools that we have? In other words,
Yeah.
when I'm face to face with you, my interaction is different than when I interact, let's say, over Zoom or even over, over the phone, certainly via email, things of that nature. And I worry sometimes, and I think there's a lot of research to underscore this point that, let's say, digital natives have lost a certain level of awareness around the holistic elements, if you will, of communication and of relationship building because of the more streamlined ways by which the communication is occurring. So what are some of the downsides of all of this quote unquote flexibility, that if a person is asking for flexibility and granted such, that they should be careful to be overly, maybe not overly, but to be significantly conscious of, so that they don't allow themselves to slip into, let's call it bad behaviors or poor choices or things like that, because they don't realize how it comes across in
Yeah.
this new environment.
Yeah, and actually, I will say that most of the time when I see the failure of flexibility happening within an organization, I would say it's not a failure of flexibility, it was a failure of implementation. Is that during the not setting appropriate sort of rules of engagement, I say flexibility is a responsibility. It's a
Hmm.
responsibility on the part of the organization. Did you create the set of policies, the practices, the infrastructure, the technology in order to support it as an organization?
Hmm.
it's a responsibility on the part of leaders to think about, okay, if I'm leading teams that are working in a flexible work environment, how am I connecting? How am I not engaging in proximity bias? How am I thinking about who I'm mentoring? How am I thinking about who am I giving feedback? Like I have to have my leadership style is going to change too. And then the responsibility on the part of individuals, which is how do I own things like the way I show up? How do I own who I'm connecting to? How do I own how am I even engaging? This is a skill, right? Like I always
Mhm.
say that being on a Zoom call and connecting with somebody in person is a skill and connecting virtually is a skill too, right?
Indeed, it is. Yeah.
And I think that people don't, if I'm showing up, I would say, I'm brought into organizations to lead workshops, let's say, or conversations with leaders on how do you show up in this new environment, and also with the individuals on how do you show up in this environment. So when I'm talking to individuals, I say, hey, you're on a Zoom call with someone, your camera on. You're in a meeting, your camera on. You're focused. You're not doing other work because you certainly wouldn't be in a conference room with your head down. You wouldn't be in your conference room on your laptop ignoring the person who's speaking. So I think that there are rules of engagement for around technology use, around how am I connecting, how am I, there were some people that I would talk to who would say, look, when I'm in a team meeting or I'm in group meetings, I might not have spoken up if I was in person, but if I'm on Zoom, I can engage in the chat. I can put my comments in the chat and I feel like I'm participating more in the meeting. Or for me as a leader, I'm able to call on someone. I would say in a meeting, you could call on someone to say, like, I'm about to call on you, or I could send a private chat to someone and say, hey, I would really like your insights. Can you speak up about this? So
Hmm.
there's different ways, and I think really kind of leaning into there are advantages to being in person, but there are also advantages to being virtual. And how do we think about those advantages and those rules of engagement and what we expect of our people and make sure we're being very transparent? We say like transparency is important. Clear is really important when you're talking
Hmm.
about flexible work environments of here's a set of expectations we now have for you. So those
Yeah,
are
makes
things I
sense.
think. What's happening when you say pitfalls are organizations that aren't preparing their leaders or their individuals on what it means to be successful in a flexible work environment.
Yeah, preparation is important, communicating, being consistent, follow through. Excellent.
Yeah.
Okay, so my last question in this segment is about mistakes. So we all make them, and thankfully, the successful people are able to learn from those mistakes and then chart a better path forward. What would you say was the biggest mistake that you made along your path that has contributed as much, if not more than anything else, to your eventual success?
I was thinking about it. One of the things I will say is very early on in my career, I was in law school applying for an internship, but it was a lesson that I was taught that I never forgot, which I had applied for two jobs. And I had one that was going to be an unpaid summer internship that they were offering, and one was going to be a paid one. And I took the paid one and I went to call back the people who had offered me the unpaid one. And the person said to me, never take a no from a person who's not in a position to give you a yes.
Hmm.
And that lesson stuck with me forever
Hmm.
of the idea of I took what they said and I didn't
Hmm.
go back and ask, hey, actually, is there any opportunity this would be a paid internship? Because
Hmm.
apparently there was. And I
Hmm.
didn't ask. I took them at their word and I didn't ask. Now, you could say, well, you would have thought they might have said something, but anyway, but that idea of really kind of asking for what you need as
Hmm.
opposed to both the don't take a no from a person who's not in a position to give you a yes, but also the idea of don't negotiate against yourself, right? That
Mm.
if you need something, ask.
Yeah.
Uh, so there's a lot of people who need flexibility, but assume that their employer could not possibly offer it to them. And so they don't
Right.
ask. And I
Right.
say, ah,
Okay. I hope you're ready for some rapid fire. We're going to
man,
keep these short and sweet. Coffee, tea, or something else to start the day.
tea, always tea.
Okay. A book that you've read recently that inspired you.
Oh, I just read The Seven Rules of Self-Reliance by Maha Abu Nain, and it was really good.
Awesome. The place you'd love to work remotely.
Paris,
Your favorite way to unwind after a busy day.
to go for a walk.
One piece of advice for your younger self.
believe in unlimited possibilities.
The best compliment you've ever received about your work.
That, oh, this is a longer one, but somebody said to me, one of their leaders after a meeting with me that I was running an executive committee meeting, said she gave me the space to hear myself talk and realize what I was saying didn't make sense, but she didn't make me feel like that.
Nice. A skill you'd love to master instantly.
Oh, a skill. A skill I would like to master instantly. Meditation.
Okay, good. A fun fact about yourself most people don't know.
I started my career as an assistant tie buyer before I went to law school.
Your ideal weekend in 3 words.
Family, friends, and fun.
Nice. And finally, a productivity tip that helps you to get more done.
Focus on one thing and then move on to the next thing.
Okay, so this has been a great conversation, Manar. I really appreciate all that you have had to share with us, and I am sure that everybody listening is just intrigued and wants to learn more. How can people reach you, find out about your work? Where can they find you?
So the flexibility paradigm is out. Certainly ordering the book is great. The Diversity and Flexibility Alliance is dfalliance.com. So reach out there. And then on LinkedIn, you can please reach out, send messages, contacts. I'm always looking at that. So all
Awesome.
3 of those areas.
Okay, so before I let you go, please leave us with one final lesson.
Define success for yourself. The idea of, I believe in living your all and defining what that all is to you. So that's my life lesson, is always to define my own vision of success.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so very much. I learned a lot. Very much enjoyed the conversation, and I certainly am very excited to put this out there. So thanks again for
Likewise.
being with us today.
Thank you so much. Enjoy.
My pleasure.
Thanks so much for listening to this episode and for investing in yourself so that you can lead to succeed. Before you go, don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review the show. Your feedback gives the show more social proof and encourages more folks to listen.